Welcome to the Macmillan Report. I'm Marilyn Wilkshire, host, and our guest is Mehmet Kurt, who is a visiting professor in the Council on Middle East Studies. He is an anthropologist, filmmaker, and human rights activist. Professor Kurt's research centers on the anthropology of religion, political sociology, and ethnography, with a specific focus on political Islam and civil society in Kurdish Turkey and Islamist mobilization among the Turkish diaspora in Europe and the United States. He examines the relationship between state policy and non-state actors to better understand Islamist mobilization, its political, social, and economic grounds, and its influences on the masses in comparative perspective. Today we'll talk with Professor Kurt about his book, Kurdish Hizbullah in Turkey, Islamism, Violence, and the State. Welcome, Professor Kurt.
Thank you very much for having me.
Let's start with an overview of your book. Tell us about it.
Well, the book is the first major anthropological study of Hezbollah in Turkey. Previous to my work, basically, there was a few journalistic accounts and few other policy papers focusing on security aspect of Hezbollah, but nothing really tangible in terms of anthropological aspect of this understudied yet very important group. So the book is divided into 3 chapters, and the first chapter provides a historical, sociological analysis of Hezbollah from its ideological worldview to its violent origin and its transformation to more civic form of engagement. I would say that basically the available information on Hezbollah previous to this book was just limited to security aspects. So basically this chapter kind of like provided an overall trajectory of what Hezbollah is based on my research and interviews with my research participants. And the second chapter focuses on the daily life aspect of Hezbollah members, their memories of the past, their remembrance, but also their reflections on contemporary matters. In this way, I analyzed the group belonging, the strong group belonging, the in-group love and kind of out-group hate within Hezbollah, but also I look at the construction of ethno-religious identity among Hezbollah members, as well as the social segregation and the legitimization of violence among its members. The Hezbollah is known with its violent activities in the 1990s during the civil war between the PKK and the Turkish state, but less known aspect of this violence is the involvement of Hezbollah, who are responsible of killing more than 500 Kurdish civilians in the Kurdish region, while also losing 200-300 of its own members. And the third chapter of the book is basically a discourse analysis of novels and stories. Most of them are semi-biographical. So previous to 2000s, basically Hezbollah has benefited from other literatures available and written by Turkish Islamists or like other writers of the Middle East. But in the process, basically they have produced their own literature, mostly written by Hezbollah members who are imprisoned due to their involvement in violent activities. So I look at basically the perception of self, the representation issues, the representation of others, prominently the PKK, the Kurdistan Workers' Party, but also the state and the Jews and so on. And since it is a prison literature, basically there is a lot of elaboration of the prison conditions and like how basically these prisoners remember the past and how they want to present it to the new generations of Hezbollah, who are now more like legal entities and like their activities are more around civil society organizations and lately around the political party.
Okay, so what is Hezbollah and what motivates its members?
Hezbollah is basically an ultra-conservative Islamist group. Its membership base is mostly consisted of Kurds with some Arabs and Turks as well, but I would say that 95% of their members and supporters are Kurdish citizens who basically were displaced in the 1990s during the forced displacement. And its members are basically kind of anti-state, but in a way, basically, their relation to the political Islam, but also to their ethnic Kurdish identity is quite complicated to understand. But basically, Hezbollah, from the ideological point of view, is an eclectic group. They were influenced by Iran Islamic Revolution, by Muslim Brotherhood, by the Kurdish Islamist thinker Saidi Nursi, but also their leaders and founders basically have been trained, and they get their first ideological formation from the Turkish Islamists, and especially from the National Vision movement. Milli Görüş, it is known in Turkish.
So what motivates them? What is their motivation? You had mentioned also violence. They are typically known to be a violent group, yes?
Yeah. I mean, violence used to be a prominent part of Hezbollah activities in the 1980s and 1990s. Their motivation at the beginning was to establish an Islamic state. However, they have never engaged with really overthrowing the regime, although this has been kind of a part of their discussions in the 1980s and 1990s. However, they got involved in the kind of intercommunal conflict with the PKK members and with the civilians in the process, and they were infiltrated by the Turkish state and security forces in the process. So the question of impunity here is quite important to think about, because while Hezbollah members got involved in this violence, which was quite prominent in the region in the 1990s during the civil war, they were almost never investigated or prosecuted by the state. So this motivation at the beginning was to basically kind of establish a top-down Sharia regime by overthrowing the secularist state, the Kemalist state. However, after 2000s, basically, their leader was killed, and 10,000s of their members were imprisoned, and they disappeared from public space for a few years, and they reappeared through civil society organizations, through legal entities, dormitories, newspapers, magazines, TV channels, and later on a political party. So I think kind of their orientation and motivation has changed from the 80s and 90s, and now they are more basically like kind of aiming to establish a society, a bottom-up, through grassroots organizations.
With religion as a large part of the way that they present themselves?
Yeah,
no?
depends. I mean, yeah, definitely religious ideology, Islamism is an important aspect of Hezbollah's understanding of society and politics. But also after their legalization of their activities, at the beginning they were more universal, kind of like impacted by the universal understanding of Ummah, but they didn't have concrete relations to the tangible aspects of Kurdish society. But after they legalized their activities, they realized that the society they live in is the Kurdish society. So I think in that process they gained more kind of ethno-religious aspect.
How big is the Hezbollah group?
I would say that through their public events like the Blessed Bird Festival, where they celebrate Muhammad's birthday every year in early April, they attract about like 500,000 to 1 million people to their activities. This doesn't mean that all these people are supporting Hezbollah. Their electoral success has been quite limited, receiving around 200,000 votes. So I would assume that 500,000 is their social base, which is, I think, kind of 5–6% of Kurdish society living in Turkey.
So how did you come to be interested in studying Hezbollah? I knew you grew up in Turkey.
Yeah, I grew up in a Kurdish city on the Syrian border, a city called Mardin. And I grew up observing Hezbollah and this urban conflict between Hezbollah and the PKK. And obviously the state violence was an important aspect of daily life. In the last 10, 15 years, basically, there is a growing interest in Kurdish studies and in Kurds and in general. So in this new wave of Kurdish studies, basically, we see many people working on understudied or overlooked aspects of Kurdish society and politics. So Kurdish nationalism, Kurdish insurgencies, mainly the PKK, the gendered mobilization, Kurdish women movement, Turkish Islamism, and so on have been studied. But basically, there wasn't any study about the group before I started doing this work. And in a way, it was quite difficult to work with this group because for about 20 years, they have been underground, quite violent, and no one really was willing to kind of encounter this past. But at the time when I started working on the group, basically there was a relatively peaceful environment that I could conduct my research, talk to the former members of Hezbollah, but also the current members of the Hezbollah-affiliated civil society organizations or other entities. I was well placed to do this study because I studied theology in my undergraduate degree. I speak Kurdish and Arabic, and basically, initially, I knew just two people. So I started from there.
So let's talk about the methodology for the book. How did you go about getting the research that you needed?
Yeah. As I said, initially, I just knew two people. One of them was a person who I knew from high school years, and another one from university years. And I knew that these people were involved in Hezbollah during their teenage years for 2-3 years, but then they left the organization. So I started talking to them. I visited this person basically who was a former Hezbollah member, currently a Sufi and an imam working in a mountain village. So I visited him and we together visited his sheikh. And I wanted to talk to him. Although I have known him for more than 15 years, we have never really talked about this issue. And the book starts with this testimony, basically. So as an anthropologist, basically, I have done a lot of participant observation to public events, seminars, conferences, celebrations, rallies. I visited these people in their workplace, in their offices, and also I've conducted in-depth interviews, but basically based on snowball sampling. That a person I talked to vouched for me for another, and I had a few gatekeepers basically who facilitated my access to other members. And eventually I have talked to about 50 people. Half of them agreed to basically speak to me on record. And in a way, I managed to talk to ordinary members, people who have been in prison due to some allegations of their affiliation to Hezbollah, the members and leaders of the civil society organizations, lawyers, but also the members of wider society, basically, who have known this group through their kinship and like family ties or neighborhood and so on.
So in talking to these people, what did you learn about the daily lives of the people who are in Hezbollah?
Yeah.
Does it vary tremendously or not so much?
I think the second chapter of my book mainly deals with this issue, and I've learned a great deal. First of all, I have managed to understand how Hezbollah members basically operated in urban spaces through very secretive and strict measures of security. But also basically I was able to see the gender issues, the perception of self, and like how basically they engage with each other and their ideological training, their businesses, and so on. But the most surprising part of it was basically this challenging emergent issue of their engagement with their Kurdish identity, because there is this tendency in Kurdish society, because of their involvement in the violence usually supported or at least facilitated by the state, there is this tendency to basically reject Kurdish Hizbullah or the Hizbullah members of not being Kurds or not doing anything related to the Kurds. Instead, I've noticed that basically all of these people had a strong sense of Kurdishness, but mostly constructed based on their religious ideology, and quite static in a way that, I have noticed that they did not really engage with the changing and transforming aspects of Kurdish society and Kurdish politics. But what they wanted to do is to create this ideal, Muslim ideal, and kind of transform the Kurdish society based on these ideals, recreating references, engaging with the figures of the past, such as Sheikh Said or Saladin, and so on and so on.
So for people who aren't in Hezbollah and living amongst them, if they were seen to not be going along with their particular religious tenet, would they find themselves in trouble, or some kind of violence would happen to them?
Depends on where it is taking place, but definitely it happened in the 1990s. First of all, it happened to me. I was in a boarding school, and there was Hezbollah members forcing people to do prayers. And those who did not agree, or those who rejected, basically were beaten up. But at the same time, this ultra-conservatism basically manifested in itself to attack basically secular people, mostly women. And some of them resulted in executions. So Gonca Kurish, for example, an Islamist feminist figure, was killed by Hezbollah in that process due to these processes. But later on, I think they developed more tolerance, or at least they came to an understanding that these attacks are not good for their reputation and perception. So now I think they kind of do more legal protest instead of putting pressure or inflicting physical violence on people. Although in the recent years we have seen that Hezbollah again appeared in public spaces armed and executing several Kurdish activists in 2014.
And the Turkish government does not step in and do anything about this?
This is a very important aspect of how we can understand Hezbollah. Because in a way, they have their own agenda. They are not a proxy of the state, but definitely they collaborate with the state. In the past, this collaboration has been through executing the PKK members or the activist figures.
So they're working for the government?
We could say that, working for the government. In recent years also, we see basically their collaboration transformed into a legal collaboration. So for the first time, we see the Hezbollah-affiliated political party, Hüdapar, the Party of God, or the Free Cause Party, have met the government representatives. They have been provided more space. Their activities are facilitated. Their civil society organizations receiving the governmental money and support through projects and other means. So definitely there is a strong connection between the Hezbollah movement and the state, as it appeared to be.
So what do you ultimately conclude in your book?
As at the beginning of my talk, I explained basically there was this single, simplistic, security-focused perspective on Hezbollah. So in a way, I think my conclusion to provide a more nuanced anthropological account of this understudied past. So in the historical sociological analysis of Hezbollah, basically, I've provided some information that wasn't really available to some Hezbollah members themselves, who basically, after reading the book, saying that we didn't know that this existed. On the other hand, I think My contribution through this work was to present the intertwined dynamics of ethno-religious identity among the Hezbollah members and how it manifests itself in the daily life. But also, I think an important element of it was to make sense of how the violence occurred to be, how the violence was legitimized towards their Kurdish counterparts, the PKK, for example. And how basically the processes of violence and the layers of identity formation among Hezbollah members.
Okay, so what are your next steps? Are you going to be drawing on this, this book to create another book, or what are your plans moving forward?
So while working on Hezbollah, basically I have noticed a proliferation of many Islamic civil society organizations operating in the Kurdish region. So I wanted to expand my research and do more work on these organizations, especially following the first political clash between the Gülenists and the state. Basically, there was a lot of transformation and replacement of this powerful organization. But also, when I basically finished my book, it occurred to be around the same time when ISIS invaded the northern Syrian town of Kobani. And I have observed within months basically that many people either joined al-Nusra or ISIS or the Kurdish forces, the YPG and YPJ. So I wanted to conduct a research on youth radicalization and civil society and state in Turkey, and I've conducted an ethnographic fieldwork with about 15 civil society organizations, but also with many young men and women in these regions across Turkey-Syrian borders at the time when basically everyone was talking about these radicalization trajectories. So that is my most recent research, but at the moment I have published a few articles from there. Some are forthcoming.
So will you be looking at why people join forces with certain groups as part of your work?
Yeah, I provide a conceptual framework why basically people end up in these decisions.
So what do you think the future holds for Hezbollah in Turkey?
I mean, definitely they are more powerful now. They have a more social base. Legalizing their activities provided a space to Hezbollah and related organizations to expand, to reach people without any hesitation. Before they were just a secretive, illegal underground organization, but now they need the prime minister, they need, they meet the president of the country, and they can influence the policy making, they can benefit from this like legal, governmental support and so on. The future is not clear as the future of the Middle East. We will see basically how they will play a role within the Kurdish society, but also within the trans-border politics of the Middle East.
All right, so more to come. We will look forward to hearing more from you.
Hopefully.
Thank you for being here and sharing your work.
My pleasure. Thank you.
For more information about Professor Kurt and his work, please visit our website at macmillanreport.yale.edu. Be sure to join us again for another episode of the Macmillan Report, made possible through funding from the Whitney and Betty Macmillan Center for International and Area Studies at Yale.